is a youth engagement methodology. And as you can hear, we are recording today's session so that we can share this also with those that were unable to join, because we got a lot of interest. Unfortunately, the timing and the time zones didn't work out for everyone. This is also a Zoom call, so I don't probably have to repeat some of the practices that are expected during a Zoom call. So if you don't speak, please mute yourself. But if you want to raise a question, please type it in the chat while we are having kind of our presentation, but then there will be time for questions also at the end, and feel free to raise your hand for raising a question as such. So let's get started. Next slide, please. As I said, I'm delighted to join you here all, and delighted that you all can join us as well. But I'm not the only one today who's gonna share some of the findings. We have a amazing team that already presented some of our findings yesterday in an in-person event in Berlin. And I'm gonna very quickly introduce themselves and then call upon some of them throughout the presentation as well. From Tanzania, today we have Mahadia Tunga, who is the co-founder of the Tanzania Data Lab. From Kyrgyzstan, we have Lira Jureva, who is the director of SOS Children's Villages. From Moldova, we have Anna Kovalchuk, who is the project coordinator at the National Youth Council of Moldova. And from India, we have Tanusha Bank, who is at Dasra and is an analyst with regard to catalytic philanthropy, but was also involved, of course, in our NextGenData initiative. And then from the data tank, we have Ellen Murray and Moise Schaak, who were the drivers behind this event and the initiative as such. And I forgot to introduce myself. I'm Stefaan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of the data tank. Next slide. And I will be kind of the host today, but as I said, much of the work, if not all of the work, was done with the people that I just introduced earlier as well. For those who don't know the data tank, let me start with like a 1-second propaganda. We are a do and think tank based in Brussels, but as you can see, with a global footprint as well. And the work of the data tank is really focused on how do we unlock data's potential, how do we gather, access, and reuse data responsibly so that we are better equipped to tackle the pressing issues of our time. And the rationale is that there is a lot of data already collected. Unfortunately, there is some kind of a mismatch between the data generated and the need for data in order to leverage that data to solve public problems. And so the data tank is specifically focused and hones in on the issue of how do we actually start reusing data in ways that is responsible. And indeed, thanks, Moise, for going to the next slide. The emphasis is on responsible. And so one of the initiatives that really focuses on how do we reuse data responsibly is the NextGenData initiative that we developed together with the Botnar Foundation and with the partners that are on today's call as well. And the focus of the NextGenData is to really look into how can we build a future where data actually serves youth, but also serves youth in ways that aligns with their expectations and aligns with their preferences. And so how do we make sure that indeed data is used, but then also is used in ways that doesn't harm them, but also in ways that aligns with their expectations. Next slide. And so the key focus of the NextGenData is really to think about how do we actually establish the preferences and expectations of youth? How do we then turn this into actionable recommendations that can shape how data is being reused for youth so that it benefits them and so that it also aligns with their preferences? And specifically, we are focusing on how do you do this at the point of service delivery when data is being collected, very valuable data, but all quite often collected in ways that doesn't align with their preferences or is not being reused in ways that then actually serves their needs and their concerns as well. Next slide. And so the real rationale for the project of NextGenData starts with this observation and the premise that when youth seek services, quite often they are asked to share data, which is obviously important because without understanding what the needs are, without understanding how services can help youth, it obviously might not be the best allocation of resources. Unfortunately, what we see is that at this point of service delivery, or at the point when youth seek services, there's quite often a power asymmetry emerging, where data is being collected or data is being requested, but without taking into account what the preferences of youth might be with regard to what data is being shared and how it is then subsequently being reused. And so we have this situation where, on the one hand, sometimes data is kind of not collected so that we actually have invisibles, or on the other hand, where data is being over-collected. Now, the question then is, of course, how can we actually provide some more agency to youth, especially at the point of service delivery? Next slide. And unfortunately, when we look into that question, the only vehicle quite often, next slide, please. Oh, yeah, here we are. The only vehicle currently available is quite often through consent. Now, consent is a very important vehicle to anyway be able to at least opt in quite often whether you want to share data. But as you can imagine, when you are in need, quite often that vehicle is very raw, is very limited, and there's not really that much agency with regard to what are the conditions under which you would like data to be shared. And there is quite often no opportunity to really start having a conversation about what is the opportunity of the data being shared for reuse in ways that benefits youth, in ways that actually benefits youth in alignment with what they hope the data that they share can do. Next slide. And so what we see then quite often is that because there's limited agency and because there is quite often distrust in how then data is being collected, we see quite often very harmful effects from that kind of lack of agency. And because the design of how data is being collected at the point of services doesn't take those kinds of concerns into account, and it leads to distrust on how data is being collected. And one result of that is so-called privacy protective behavior, by which we mean that youth does not seek out services, mainly because they fear that the data that will be collected might eventually haunt them later in life. Whether it's, anyway, it might discriminate, it might create more stigma, or it might actually harm them when they, for instance, seek services, such as services in terms of employment, or, for instance, services that are needed when you are a refugee or, in some cases, undocumented migrants as well. And so it's super important to take into account how data is being designed at the point of service delivery, and that it is designed in ways that it is actually trusted and, of course, responsible, so that we can prevent this kind of privacy protective behavior, which may frankly lead to public health crisis in general as it relates to youth. Next slide. So the questions that we sought to answer through this initiative were really questions on how do we go beyond invisibility, right? So we acknowledge that data is important and needs to be collected in one way or another, especially also then being reused to solve some of the challenges that children have. But how do we then prevent overcollection? How do we prevent kind of information asymmetries? How do we go beyond consent? Next slide. And so the research questions, because this was in part both a do and think initiative, the research questions that we started with was, for instance, how can we increase agency among youth? How can we increase trust through youth engagement, right? How do we actually understand what they actually want? How do we do this in a meaningful way? Next slide. Because the challenge, of course, is that you cannot just start a conversation. You actually really need to prepare Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, thanks. You need to really prepare this well. And you need to also start thinking about how do you facilitate a deliberation among youth that is meaningful and where the results are actually actionable. Because one of the concerns that we also had when we designed this initiative was that, all right, quite often you have engagements, you have youth expressing what they care about, and then what, right? How do we actually then make sure that this goes and gets implemented in the design of services so that the services are better, but also the data, of course, collection is better. The question is, of course, all right, what are the factors that enable agency and meaningful deliberation? Because frankly, when we looked at the literature and some of the practices, it was very hard to understand, are there unique factors, especially when we talk about data, that we need to embed in the design of those deliberations? Next slide. And what we hope to do with this initiative, which I think is fairly unique, was to also do it in several countries. As you will hear in a second, we actually managed to engage 4 partners across the world. And part of the effort was also to understand, how do you actually do deliberation with youth in those different areas? Are there differences that we need to take into account? And is there a way to even develop a common method so that we take out the transaction cost of doing this? Because this is not simple to do. And as you will hear, we actually learned a lot by doing, but how can we then develop a method that can be replicated while at the same time taking cultural sensitivities and cultural differences into account? So how do we make sure that it's not too standardized, but at least also allows for some flexibility as well? So next slide. So this is what we try to do. And Moise, if I can call upon you very briefly to explain before we dive deep into the methodology, which, as I said, is one of the deliverables. We have other deliverables as well. But if you can briefly explain how we got to that deliverable and who was involved, then at least we will have a better understanding on kind of the work that went into the creation of the engagement methodology. Over to you.
Thanks. Thank you, Stefan, and really apologies for the lag that you're right now witnessing. I don't know whether it's a problem with my system or with Zoom, but anyways, we'll go ahead. So, as Stefan was mentioning, this project is a multi-country comparative action research project. And this was possible just because we had some amazing partners working in these countries who have been working with us for the last 1 year. And so the first partner, as you can see on the screen, is from Tanzania, the data lab from the Tanzania Data Lab, SOS Children Villages, Kyrgyzstan, National Youth Council of Moldova, and Dasra from India. And in the last 1 year, like all of us collectively went through this extensive process of how do we meaningfully engage the youth. We did that along with our technical partner, which is Data for Children Collaborative, who was equally involved when we were doing the ethical review of our youth engagement processes. And so, as you see, this has been a collective effort. And today we are at a very important moment where we are sharing some of our interesting learnings. So I just wanted to just call out these partners and just thank them for their involvement through the project. Stefan?
Go ahead. Next slide, please. So
yeah. Maybe since I'm struggling with my internet and I'm speaking right now, let me just try to.
Okay, I can do the next thing. If you just do the next
Yes.
slide, then I can
Yes.
talk to that. Sorry about that, Moise. So the question is, of course, we had 4 amazing partners. What did we do? And this slide will give you kind of a, if we get there, we'll give you an overview of some of the activities that we did. And as you can see, this was oops, we got no more slides, Moise. We had a very intensive set of activities where the core, of course, was trying to hold a set of youth assemblies. And so if we can see the slides eventually, then you will see that we had 4 youth assemblies that we did. And a youth assembly, just as some backup, is not just a one-off engagement, right? It actually requires Okay, so we have, okay, there we go. It requires an intensive, okay, something is going on with the slides. It requires an intensive engagement by the youth and by the partners as well over several weeks that enable them to really go deep into certain kinds of issues. And we also held, anyway, okay. So
I'm sorry,
I'm not
let
sure
me
what's
just
going
try
on.
again. Okay.
Sorry about that. It also involved several decision maker workshops and so on, which we will go into detail as well. All right, next slide. So what was the output of this? And as I said, one of the output, which is why I presume you all joined today, was kind of a toolkit, because as you can see, we learned a lot by doing. And what we hope to do was not just to share some of the findings and saying, this is what you taught, but also turn it into actually something that can be a leave behind or something that we can then fine tune and prototype further moving forward. And so this is the toolkit, next slide, that we have developed and that we can also share in the Slack perhaps, or in the chat for those who want to go deeper after this call as well. It suffices to say is that the methodology entails multiple stages, with the first stage being scoping and exploring, the next stage being really, if we can go to the next slide, operationalizing and planning, next stage, deliberation and prioritization, next stage, engaging in design, and the next stage, showcase and collaborate. And so why do we show these different stages is to show that basically youth engagement typically is thought of as stage 3. But in order to do this well, you really need to take the time and exactly identify the partners that can help you establish the scoping, but also establish then the operationalization of, for instance, who do you invite? How do you invite youth to the table? How do you prepare them to be able to engage meaningfully? But then also not just stop at the moment when the engagement stops. How do you actually then turn that into recommendations? How do you prototype solutions? And how do you then make sure that those who can implement the recommendations actually are aware of the work that has been done? So how do you showcase and collaborate it? That's why we have 5 stages. Next slide. And so I'm going to go very briefly through each stage, starting with the scope and explore. Next slide. And then call upon some of our partners as well in order to reflect on kind of lived experience on implementing the methodology, because I think that's probably more interesting to hear than just some kind of an abstract set of steps. But suffice to say is that really important to scope out the initiative. And at the Data Tank, we took quite some time to do this well, which of course means that if we want to operationalize that in different countries, then we actually need to have partners that youth trusts and also can actually engage with youth in ways that are meaningful and that are subsequently actionable as well. So the first step is really partner selection. Then we started, because we were focusing, as I mentioned at the beginning, focusing specifically on data collection and data reuse to improve services to youth. We then subsequently engaged the partners in understanding what kind of topics. Was it mental health? Was it youth employment? Was it other topics and services that we should prioritize within that country? So we really scoped the service that youth cared about. And then we also try to capture the current state of data collection and data practices at that point of service delivery. And so that's the first step, is really scoping this out before you engage with youth to actually have a better understanding of the kind of ecosystem in which data is being collected, if at all, and then more importantly, how it is potentially being reused for other purposes than the initial stage as well, and what are kind of the policies as well. Next slide. Now, to implement that, we developed for every stage, we developed quite some extensive questions And I'm not sure, Moise, whether you wanna or able to talk
Sure.
about this, because I'm sensitive
Yes.
to your internet connection there. Over to you.
Happy to do that. Thanks, Stefan. So as you can see here, we followed first by just understanding the practices of the service providers. So all our partners, they reached out to the service providers who were providing services to the youth, and they actually used the data reuse inquiry wheel, which was largely about understanding what types of data is usually collected by the service providers, why is the data collected, who is collecting the data, how is the data used, and when it is collected, where it is stored. So this was the inquiry we actually that guided us throughout the project, not only to understand the data practices of the service provider, but also to actually deliberate with the youth in the subsequent stages. Parallelly, we also wanted to understand what are the current perspectives, concerns, and preferences of the youth around data, and that was the baseline study even before we started engaging with them. So we again tried to we use this Likert scale to just find out in terms of what is the current understanding of consent, what is their current understanding about data use. So we did that, and then we have also created a comparative report both for the practices of the service providers in the countries as well as for the youth and the youth agency in those countries.
Great, thanks. Next slide, please. And so feel free to ask questions, by the way, in the chat. We will come back to those when we open up for questions as well. Or we can also address some of those while we are going through this. The next stage after scoping out and really getting a sense of what are the practices was then to operationalize and actually plan the engagement. Next slide. And that, of course, requires to first understand, well, who do we want to invite to the deliberation? Who do we want to have at the table? And so we did this through an open call. But as you will hear, perhaps we also had other methods that we used in order to really get a good representation of youth that we can engage with. Then we also did an ethical assessment. And I think Alex is on the call today as well, who helped us from Data for Children Collaborative to really walk the talk. Because to a large extent, of course, this is not just a youth engagement about data. By engaging youth, you also collect data. And the question then was, how do we make sure that we do this in an ethical way? And how can we develop a standard of ethical assessment prior to engaging with youth and then during the engagement as well, making sure that staff is trained to engage with youth in a meaningful way, especially, of course, if you start developing engagements around topics like mental health, which might disclose sensitive data by the participants themselves. And so we really took this seriously. And this is also something that is part of the methodology that we propose, is to actually really have an ethical assessment as well. And we can come back to that in a second. And then also we wanted to have a clear understanding, what is the kind of understanding among the participants? So once we had participants apply and once they were selected, to also try to understand what is their current understanding of data, but more importantly, what is their current kind of sense of concerns with regard to data as well, so that we had a better understanding on how to then structure our deliberation with youth. Next slide. Now here I may want to call upon one of our partners, Anna, perhaps from Moldova. I don't know, Anna, whether you want to reflect briefly on the open call that you had. And this was kind of also here an example of, and this was Dasra in India, how they try to recruit recruit participants. Anna, do you want to briefly reflect on how you went about an open call in Moldova?
Yeah, sure, I can. Thank you for this opportunity to share actually our findings and our work through our project. Yes, we made an open call. This was our methodology, let's say, to invite and involve young people to participation. And to compare, Moldova is not that big as India, for example. And we tried also to cover as much regions, as much areas as possible. So we shared our application with our partners, with our local communities to make sure that it will be as much covered, as I said, as possible. So we had a representative from different areas, and also we worked as with Ukrainians who are living in Moldova currently, and with local communities. So we had from rural areas, from city centers, from some different parts of Moldova people. So we also can invite them in our offline meetings because, again, our destination can do it to make everyone offline. And for us, it was important, to make this call as much understandable as possible, because we also discussed with our partners that people very like to speak about AI or something very fancy and great that we have in our time. But when it comes to data usage, data reuse, people like, what? We really need to talk about that, especially use kind of here. We understand, but are you sure that we can do something here? So we tried to invite them more in a use-friendly way, let's say like that, to make it interesting and kind of more interacting. So with entertainment or something like that. And of course, even after they applied, we made somehow info sessions, maybe more like call to all of them. And even at that stage, when we invited them to participate, several was kind of no. I thought it would be something more interesting. So we also had such. I will not say that it was problem, but challenge that we faced and went through it. But still, it gave us this people who actually interested in it. So we didn't invite people who will be, I will listen and go. But they actually show their own interest and continue to work.
Great. Thanks so much, Anna. And yes, that's one of the recurrent, which we will come back to that as well, recurrent challenges of engaging youth around data. First of all, what do we mean by data? Secondly, how can we talk about data in ways that is aligned with their understanding, but also in a way that is humanized. And I think that turns out to be a real challenge in this space, which was one of the findings of the engagement, is that if you want to talk about data, first of all, you need to do a call in ways that actually attracts individuals that understand what this will be about, and then also have an engagement in ways that is aligned with their understanding and a way and is youth-friendly, using language that is youth-friendly as opposed to kind of abstract and academic, which unfortunately is quite often the case when it comes to conversations around data. Thanks for that, Anna. Next slide. And we can come back to that as well on how other partners experience that. I already mentioned, I'm not going to go into detail. As I said, we have Alex on the call from Data for Children Collaborative, who we perhaps can call upon during the Q&A if there are questions about that. But we did do an intensive ethical review as well, both at the level of the method that we were using, but also on how we, of course, communicated, what were kind of our assessment of possible risks, and how did we go about mitigating some of those when we started to engage with youth. But also we did some investment in actually facilitation and how do you do this in ways that are ethical as well. Next slide. And again, we can come back to that, but that's a fundamental part of the methodology as well. Now, once, of course, we did all the planning, then it was, anyway, showtime and actually time to actually engage with youth, because that was the whole point of the, next slide, of the whole enterprise as well. And so we did develop those youth assemblies, but it had a few components because, and here I might want to call upon Mahadia in a second, is that, as you heard already from Anna, in order to have a meaningful conversation with youth about data, quite often you need to also start introducing certain concepts. You need to introduce what do we talk about data, but also you have to start introducing what are some of the positive use cases of data, because what we've learned as well from our partners is that quite often when they talk about data, it's always in the negative, and don't understand that data can actually also be positive if they figure out how to design it in ways that might deal with some of the negative concerns that they might have. And so there's also a need to introduce use cases on what data actually can do in the positive as well. And so that's kind of part of the methodology, is to really start thinking about what is the material that needs to be developed in order to educate, in order to bring them to a level where actually the conversation can be meaningful. Then, of course, it's about deliberation. Next slide. When we started deliberating, what we really hoped to do was to have a conversation that allowed us to have a more detailed assessment. And this was based upon some of the work that I had done in the past in the context of data assemblies and other work of engagement, where we learned that if you have a conversation with individuals, including youth, of course, about how do you feel about data being reused, their answer will be, well, it depends. And then the question is, of course, how do you determine how it depends? And it depends according to A, what is the purpose for the reuse? And so it was very important to have a conversation with youth about different purposes that could be seen as beneficial or purposes that could be seen as potentially harmful. Then the other aspect on it depends, well, it depends on what data, right? Is it sensitive data? Is it data that discloses personal preferences, for instance? Then not only what data, but how is the data being shared or accessed? And so that's then the how. Is it anonymized? Then it's a whole different risk profile than whether it's not anonymized. Who has access to the data? Is it a trusted public health official or a trusted health official versus it's accessible for administration purposes, but then there's no trust in, for instance, how that data might be used. I'm just saying something, but that's another aspect that needs to be considered. Is this data going to be stored forever, or is there going to be kind of a sunset with regard to how the data is going to be, and also where is the data actually stored? What's the jurisdiction? Is there actually a data protection policy within an organization that stores data, and so on? And so we use this kind of simple framework, as I said, that I had developed elsewhere as well, on why, what, how, who, when, and where, that really allows for a deliberation that goes beyond are you for or against the use of data, right? That actually really unpacks the kind of data ecosystem. And it allows also youth to really indicate that, yes, meaning certain purposes we feel is totally fine, as long as then it is limited for certain kinds of people and for certain kinds of time periods, so that it doesn't haunt us for the rest of our lives, for instance, as well. And so that was kind of the framework that we used for the deliberation. But let me call upon Mahadia, if I'm not sure, I don't see in my screen here whether you're able to engage. Let me call on Mahadia perhaps to, there you go, to perhaps also reflect on what is the necessary kind of material or the level of education, training, and onboarding for the participants in order to have that conversation, because that's something that you worked on at the Tanzania Data Lab extensively as well. Over to you, Mahadia.
Thank you, Stefan. Yeah, as you rightly said, in order to have meaningful conversation, we need to build capacity. And we saw it at the beginning of the program, where you advertise and they don't understand what exactly it means by data use. And that's why some of the youth at the beginning could not like apply for the program. Yeah, but we then also still found the gap in terms of like during the process, in terms of how to interact the data, in terms of perception, etc. So, so for us, that was the base of us thinking that we need to develop a program in which we could build capacity of youth on the data use. So yeah, so for this program to be tailored to the context, so we follow the same modality of the NextGen, first beginning with the what data it says by starting with the baseline, understanding the skill set, and so we categorized youth depending on their education background, because we also realize also that determines the learning curve, those like who are college students vis-a-vis those who like they haven't gone through tertiary education. So they have like different sets of skills, and you need to like for the college students, curriculum can be like in English, which is the formal language in Tanzania. I mean, which is instructional language in Tanzania. But for those who like have not gone through tertiary education, you need to like put your program and material in Swahili, in bilingual, basically not entirely Swahili, because some of the terms are being used in English. You have to use as they are. When you translate them in Swahili, they're going to be quite difficult, and the vice versa is also the case. So yeah, so that we are at that stage where we have like now already like do the baseline assessment to understand the skill set of youth, and we have categorized them with their different education background, and now we are developing training materials on the data use. But as you rightly said, for it to be meaningful, we also need use cases so that they can see immediately like how they are going to apply the knowledge. And in this case, we are working in the climate change. How can we use like the weather data, climate data to be to build resilient systems, be it in business, elsewhere. So yeah, so we are at that stage. Thank you, Stefan.
Great, thanks so much, Mahadia. And again, just want to emphasize also something that we've learned by working with all our partners is that data quite often is very hard to translate in different languages, right? And that's already quite often one of the problems. Meaning, Mahadia, I'm not sure what you mentioned to us is that data doesn't really, as a concept in Swahili, translate very well. And so that's already one of the challenges, right?
Yeah, exactly. We don't have a Swahili term for data. When you, like in Swahili, data and information uses the same term. So yeah, so that's the places where you can't entirely say you're going to put your curriculum in the local language, because some of the terms will be confusing. Yeah, so some of the terms you'll still have to use them in English, and then but you'll do the instructions in Swahili. So yeah, so that's kind of a bilingual because that I think contextualize the target audience. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Next slide, please. So once the once we had actually the engagement with youth, and we understood what some of their preferences and expectations were, and also trying to understand how they would want data to be reused, then obviously, as you can see, we didn't stop there because we felt it super important. Next slide, please, to go beyond just deliberation. And then we really started focusing on actually prototyping solutions. So now we've done the youth kind of the deliberation was about mainly focused on kind of diagnosing the issue. And then the question was, how do we then go about developing solutions that are youth-centric and that takes into account their preferences? And so in order to do so, we and the partners especially identified mentors that were made available to the participants in order to really start thinking about how do you go about prototyping solutions, which was then another aspect of our methodology, and how do we turn that into then kind of actionable recommendations and insights that can be shared with policymakers or with service providers in ways that then can change the practice, both in terms of using data in new ways that actually are beneficial, but also in ways that, of course, are aligned with their concerns or preferences. So if I may call upon Tanusha, because Tanusha, you did a lot of work in India on actually really providing this kind of mentorship model for participants to be able to actually prototype solutions and to really give them the skill set needed to not just diagnosing, but also coming up with kind of prototypes that work. Over to you, Tanusha.
Thanks, Stefan. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to, like Stefan mentioned, give you a brief overview of how we were able to build a little bit of a support architecture around our youth participants while they engaged in this entire initiative. And I think that began right from the time of orientation and onboarding, and it continued throughout. And we were very sensitive to the varying level of readiness with which some of our participants came to us, whether it's in terms of their past experience with data, whether it's with regards to their digital readiness, digital access, or whether they have had similar access to formal education, what is the lived experience that they come from, whether it's an urban setting, whether it's a rural setting. So we were mindful of ensuring that we ensure that there is an inclusive space for all those experiences to coexist and also to kind of converge towards the direction of recommendations for data reuse that were deeply contextual in nature. With that in mind, we had a four-layered model that we used during this phase. The first layer was the core project team, which was the backbone support or the PMO housed in Dasra. Essentially, what we were supposed to do was provide general strategic design, ensure that we had the toolkits, resource banks, the templates, the guides, everything that the youth might need ready from a program perspective, but we also try to make these as simple, as actionable, and as youth-friendly as possible. The next layer was a mentorship layer. This was a set of 4 Dasra mentors bring with them their own sectoral able to have deep mentorship sessions on each phase of how to design the pilot study with the youth. The next layer, of course, was youth facilitation. We actually and they were able to sit and feedback about how we can do the youth engagement better, how we can be more sensitive and youth friendly. And the final layer was, of course, the youth participants themselves. This was the model initially that we had set up, but during implementation, we realized that there is also a need for a lot of one-on-one support and hand holding that we did on a need basis for youth participants. And beyond that, I think parallel to kind of providing them with mentorship support, learning sessions with experts, we were also able to provide them some degree of handholding with regards to very fundamental digital skills, such as how to make a presentation, how to strategically devise a community engagement or a community questionnaire? How do you design a Google form in which to systematically collect your data? When you have that on a spreadsheet, how do you analyze these data? So some of those fundamental parallel skills that were also important is what we also sought to build. And closer to, I think, the data fest, when the youth were ready with the recommendations and we also had really confident and share their findings with the decision makers. So yeah.
Great. Thanks so much, Tanusha. And yes, we had some connectivity issues, so some parts we didn't hear well, but I think the key message here is indeed that you develop multiple layers of support and also multiple layers of evaluation feedback, right, on how to actually do this. Well, I thought it was very interesting to hear that you actually had kind of professional facilitators, youth facilitators in the room that then provided feedback on how to improve facilitation moving forward as well. And I think those are the kind of interesting lessons learned as well. Next slide. So once we had then youth working on the solution, and also, as Tanusha was saying, also developing then kind of products that can be presented in ways that might have impact, because it was also about co-designing and then subsequently sharing those results. We then subsequently, next slide, actually shared the findings and had youth present what they were, what their preferences were, but also present some of their solutions as well. And we did this, next slide, through a variety of ways. We had workshops with, this is, no, we're not going to play the video. There we go. Workshops with decision makers, but we also had a data fest in order to make it somewhat more youth-friendly in ways they could share what they've learned, and in the ways they could share some of the solutions with service providers as well. And here, if I can call briefly upon Lira from Kyrgyzstan to share briefly what was the Data Fest in Kyrgyzstan, and how was the kind of the transfer of knowledge and transfer of recommendations vis-a-vis service providers and others as well. Over to you, Lira.
Yeah, thank you. Well, Data Fest was a huge success in Kyrgyzstan. We had a very positive response from a number of youngsters who were participating in the project previously, and it was also a success in terms of invited guests who were there to share their experience, to explain to the youngsters why data-driven projects are important, why data-driven is a big deal today, and how the data can be used and reused, and why reused data is a faster and cheaper way to deliver some type of services. So it was also success since the quiz, actually it was not a quiz, it was the whole competition, intellectual competition among among several teams was such a success, because they learned things that they were not aware previously, and with the help of our professional trainers and speakers from the ICT organizations such as High Park Technologies and others, they were very much interested in all the activities that were suggested to them. So and another thing that was mainly like very demonstrative for me is that those youngsters who were requested to provide their feedback on their participation in the research about the availability of mental services, they were able to open up, and they were not afraid of saying what kind of issues they have encountered with, while during their pubertat age, and how they were able to deal with those. And now that they understand that asking for help is normal and that nothing is wrong with that, and they're not afraid being stigmatized. So this was a very huge success. And when I was there and I saw the youngsters being so positive, providing such a positive feedback and being responsive, that was actually a lot of motivation for us, for all of us. And I'm sure that at least within the circle of the youngsters that we used during the project implementation and at all of those events that we conducted, we managed to raise a level of awareness of the data-driven importance project, and usage and reusage of data, and or everything that is connected to it.
Great. Thanks so much, Lira. And yes, super important. Next slide, perhaps already, but super important to indeed emphasize is that the whole idea was to develop agency, and it was very interesting to see that through this methodology, we increased agency around data, but also around other issues, right? That actually youth became more comfortable to also engage on other topics that they otherwise might not have been engaged with. And so ultimately, one of the main kind of deliverables from that process is what we call a social license for data reuse that exactly goes beyond consent, because now we actually have an understanding what youth wants to happen with data, but then also under what conditions. And that is a fundamental, of course, difference with consent, where it's kind of a binary yes, no. And here we actually have a better understanding, and service providers have a better understanding on how to design those data initiatives, but also have then the confidence that it aligns with that social license as well. Next slide. And so this is in a nutshell, and I'm realizing that we already spent a lot of time, but I think it was worth hearing from the partners for sure. This is kind of in a nutshell the methodology that we have extracted from, as you can hear, learning by doing. This is not something that we picked out of thin air, but that we actually really prototyped, tested out in those 4 settings with the partners who went full steam ahead on many of those topics. And so while we have now a methodology that captures those lessons, we also have a better understanding on what is needed moving forward in order to really do this well. And these are just a few elements that has emerged with regards to the gaps that we have identified while trying to do this in a systematic way, because I hope what you've learned from today was that it was not just showing up and doing something. We really try to do this in a more systematic way that can then be replicated, but also that takes a whole range of concerns into account. And some of the gaps was, first of all, that it's very hard to talk about data with youth. There is no kind of material out there. It's also very abstract. And so we really need to have a youth training syllabus that introduces data in a variety of contexts. It's also very important to nurture local expertise, because that's also what they engage with better if you actually have expertise that is grounded within the context where they operate, but also that it might be useful to have youth data ambassadors that actually can fulfill that role of being the kind of ambassadors on some of the topics that youth cares about with regard to data. My view, by the way, is that many of the people, youth that went through this process, have become youth data ambassadors. And that actually the engagement strategy is not just to have a conversation, but then to have those ambassadors that have been mentored and that actually have now a better understanding to talk about the aspects as well. Other challenges is, of course, with recruitment. We didn't go into detail here, but anyway, we need to start thinking about when is actually at an opportune moment to engage youth. What is the level of, how do we do the onboarding so that everyone is kind of at a certain level that they can actually have an engagement. But also we need to start developing a stack of solutions because it's not just about identifying the problem, but then how do we then also have a stack on how do we then solve that problem? And the stack of solutions can be, and we have now a set of solutions that was prototyped by the youth, but I think we need to kind of start sharing that stack more broadly so that we don't always have to start from scratch. I already mentioned it's important to also not just showcase negative impact, but also the positive impact. And then lastly, I would say super important to have this kind of global exchange, and a global exchange that can work on actually institutionalizing this methodology, right? Because as you can see, this was done through partners, but how do you institutionalize this methodology by organizations that collect data and can reuse data? And I think we are making progress there, and we're also working on some of the scaling strategies as well. So with that, I'm gonna stop here because you, I think, got plenty of material that we have and are proud to share as a result of this kind of year-long, very intensive process, working with the partners, working with youth on trying to come up with kind of a new way to establish agency within the kind of context of data reuse for data as well. But we also try to share some of the lessons learned in terms of gaps and what actually might be needed to do this better and do this more institutionalized moving forward as well. Perhaps, Moise, we can close, or whoever is in charge of the slide deck, we can actually close the slide deck now so that we actually see kind of those that are still present here today and see whether there are any questions from the audience. Unfortunately, I didn't manage to look at the chat as well, and I don't know, Moise and Elena, whether there are already some questions from the